Um, Welcome to our online forum presented by Communities Confronting Substance Abuse and Rifa'enu. We're very pleased to introduce Rabbi Rothwachs, Dr. Rossman, and Arnie. Why did I just lose your last name, Arnie?
Goldfein.
Yes, I apologize. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to correct it and make a better intro. Arnie Goldfein has been in the Jewish recovery world for close to 35 years and is in a unique position to understand the feelings of stigma, hopelessness, remorse, shame, guilt, and fear associated with substance use disorder. He has served as president of JACS, Jewish Alcoholics, Chemically Dependent Person, and Significant Others, a program of the Jewish Board of Families and Children's Services for over 7 years, and subsequently is co-executive director of Rodfei Shalom, Inc. Both organizations are dedicated to the recovery of people with substance use issues. As a New York State certified peer advocate recovery specialist, he has helped hundreds of people to get their lives back on track to live a long-term, self-sustained, healthy life. Rabbi Rothwachs has served as rabbi at Congregation Beth Aaron in Teaneck, New Jersey since August 2002. Rabbi Rothwachs is a graduate of Yeshiva College, the Azrieli School of Jewish Education, and received his smicha from the Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary. From 1998 through 2016, Rabbi Rothwachs taught Talmud at Yeshiva University High School for Boys and the Rosenbaum Yeshiva of New Jersey, and he currently serves as head rabbi of Camp Morashah. In 2016, he was appointed director of professional rabbinics at REITs at YU. And Dr. Rossman is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in the treatment of issues related to addiction, trauma, and self-esteem. Since 2008, he has worked at the VA Hudson Valley HCS in Montrose, New York, serving as staff psychologist on the hospital's residential substance abuse and PTSD units. He also has a private practice in Teaneck, New Jersey, enjoys writing articles about mental health, and likes free building Lego sculptures. And with that, Rabbi, why don't...
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure, personal honor to have the opportunity to present to you together with my very accomplished and esteemed colleagues. I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. To cover a topic like this, to properly address it in 40 minutes is not close to impossible. It is impossible, but I can say now, 45 minutes later than the beginning of the first session, we can have a meaningful conversation, and I hope to be able to do so. We had a brief discussion last week as to how to conduct this session. Dr. Rossman had I think a very clever suggestion which worked, and we're going to do it again right now. And that is that rather than sort of discuss the issue of alcohol and Jewish ritual in the abstract and just try to sort of talk about it conceptually, to zero in and focus on a particular scenario that we can all imagine and relate to, using that as sort of a case study through which we can, discuss the connection and some of the challenges and the conflicts that we feel perhaps as individuals, but certainly as a community, when trying to reconcile some of the realities facing individuals who struggle with alcohol, and on the other hand, at least our perception of what the Jewish ritual is and the demands that it has of us. So we're going to talk about a Shalom Zachar. We're not going to talk about any particular family or case, but you can just close your eyes, if you will, and just imagine the last Shalom Zachar that you attended. And in all likelihood, there was alcohol, and very possible there was an abundance of alcohol, which means in terms of the quantity as well as the quality. I happen not to be, a maven when it comes to alcohol, but I can usually tell just, you can tell the difference between a bottle of Rashi wine and a bottle of scotch. And usually you can tell by the numbers of the bottles and the way that people who really know, the mevinim know, and I don't mean salivate. I don't mean it in a cynical, dismissive way, and perhaps not literal. But there is a certain attitude and a delight that individuals who are not necessarily struggling with alcoholism, but they really, really appreciate, a good, chashuv, expensive bottle of scotch. And often, the Shalom Zachar is a venue it is a moment in which this sort of this happens, and so therefore, as a rabbi, I guess the question is, what's my reaction to that? How do I feel about that? Is that something that makes me comfortable? Is this something that I would recommend? Is this something that I would prohibit? And the answer is, I can't answer any of those questions in the most absolute term right now, but there are a few, I would say, guidelines, and there's some important objectives that I think need to be met at all times. First of all, we must recognize that there are individuals in our community who have certain vulnerabilities and struggles in general, but particularly as it relates to what we're discussing right now, around the usage and consumption of alcohol. And maybe when we are in our own home, surrounded by the members of our immediate family, and we really know the members of our family well, so perhaps we can discuss this question in a vacuum. But once we step outside of our home, once we invite anybody else into our home, and Shalom Zachar is a perfect example, we are now in a communal setting. So we have to understand and appreciate that many individuals who struggle with alcohol, unfortunately, these problems were first generated and evolved in and through community connections. And so therefore, we need to be mindful of that. And it doesn't make a difference whether or not you know that anybody who is sitting next to you at that particular moment has a history of struggle. You have to assume that they do. Statistically speaking, if there are 20, 30 people in the room, then there are at least a handful. And it makes no difference that they're members of the Orthodox community. We are in no way whatsoever immune to this, quite to the contrary. The second point I would make is that, in Halacha, we have a concept of Ikar and Tafel. It comes up in different areas of Halacha, Hilchos Brachos, but that's not the only one. And that is that we look at what is primary and what is secondary. When it comes to alcohol at any event, I would say Shalom Zachar, but I would also include other events in which the use of alcohol is something which is not just recommended, it is something which, is appropriate. Kiddush, Havdalah, certainly Purim, Pesach, moments like this in which we traditionally include and incorporate alcohol, it is never supposed to be the ikar. It is never supposed to be the primary feature, and especially at a Shalom Zachar, which in and of itself, Shalom Zachar, there's no chiyuv to have a Shalom Zachar. It's not an obligation to attend one, so we have to keep that in mind. But when we're sitting there and you see that alcohol is sort of the centerpiece of that moment, it is glorified, which is a word that I use, and I've sometimes been called out on it by people who say that that's my subjective perspective. But okay, that's what I sometimes see. That's how I see it. A glorification of alcohol, that's inappropriate. That's something that I think we need to be mindful of and call ourselves out as a community. I would also say, without getting into the particulars right now, that, and again, I'm speaking as a rabbi, not as a mental health professional, not anybody who has any special qualifications to speak about alcohol, but as somebody who has some qualifications to speak about halacha and minhag, there are differences between halacha and minhag in general, and particularly as it relates to this issue. A person who says that it is halachically required, it is an obligation to go ahead and to get drunk on Purim, in my opinion, is ignorant. That is not a true statement. The person says that you cannot be yotze the mitzvah of kiddush without alcohol. It may be a well-meaning statement, but the person is ignorant in regard to this particular halacha. So there are differences between halachos and ritual. There's a difference between ritual and culture. I think that the presence of alcohol and the abundance that it appears as a Shalom Zachar is much more of a cultural reality than it is even a ritual one. Certainly not a halachic one, as I already mentioned. And there are differences between true cultures, history, which goes back perhaps a generation or two or several, and unhealthy and dangerous behaviors and habits that are now forming, particularly in our society today. I'll conclude my remarks with one practical suggestion, but it's an important one, because sometimes we have these conversations and, practically, the master, what do we walk away with? So I would say that, in my opinion, if and when alcohol is being served at any event, but we're talking about a Shalom Zachar right now, probably best not to offer anybody a drink, but never offer anybody a drink twice. And I've seen with my own eyes individuals who really cannot have a drink. Literally, their life depends on it. And other people, well-meaning, really with the best of intentions, will say, would you like? No, thank you. Come on, have a little, just a little. Not realizing that little, as Arnie will speak about, in a moment, could be literally, a gateway to hell for this person. And so therefore, to understand and to appreciate with the greatest of sensitivity that there are struggles that people have that we perhaps cannot relate to, and to be as sensitive as we can in general, but particularly at moments like this, to, assume, sort of assume the worst, and be as careful as we can not to put somebody in a situation where we are, pressuring them to indulge in a way that would be very harmful to them. Okay, I'm gonna come up for air and pass the floor over to Tzachi, Dr. Rossman.
Thank you, Rabbi Rothwax. It's interesting doing a session after doing it previous, because it gave me some time to kind of conceptualize different things that maybe we missed or didn't highlight as much, last time, that I would like to address on this meeting. And it was interesting, again, what you mentioned about the Iker and Tafel, really the primacy oftentimes that alcohol sometimes plays, I would say, during Jewish ritual as opposed to as part of Jewish ritual, because I think, as you mentioned, a lot of it is, if you will, self-imposed, right? The people participating in the ritual choose to elevate alcohol to this is why we're all getting together, as opposed to thinking about, well, what is the religious reason or the Jewish ritual reason that we're getting together? And I think that oftentimes is, in my mind, one of the most problematic issues, is the idea that the ritual, the religious part, gets lost because of the great emphasis that some people place on alcohol that's being served. And while we're talking about a Shalom Zachar, I would be remiss to not expand the horizon to anything related to Judaism that people are, or any time related to Judaism that people are involving alcohol. So whether it be Simchas Torah, whether it be Purim, whether it be Kiddush, whether it be at a Shabbos meal where you already made Kiddush, so the religious, the Jewish piece, the halachic piece is done, but now all of a sudden, okay, well, Kiddush is over, now let me bring out my entire liquor cabinet to show everyone, what I have that I value. And lamented, on a personal level, how sometimes I'll be at a meal and there's more time spent on the different, or analyzing the different bottles of liquor or wine than it is talking about, let's say, the Parsha or Yantiv or Shabbos. So that's just something that I would begin with. The other point is that this is a very poignant topic for the time period that we find ourselves, especially during the pandemic. There was a recent study that was put out that said, as compared to this time last year, alcohol use in the United States is up 14%. In certain segments of the population, that number goes up to 19%. And what what I'm concerned about is, within the context of one's own home, if alcohol use is increasing, then my concern is when the society opens or when gatherings are happening again, and again, the social elements of alcohol use was present, what that will mean for the people who might now have a stronger, more intimate relationship, if you will, with alcohol as a result of the pandemic. Also, another number that really strikes a chord for me is that they asked people what the negative impact that alcohol has had on them, in the past year. And there was an increase for women of 39% more problems as a result to their alcohol intake, and for men, 27 greater negative impact of their alcohol use. And that's just a unbelievable number. And I think what it speaks to is that oftentimes alcohol is more than just something that one does, but it serves a purpose. And we mentioned this in our last session, is that as a substance, alcohol is addictive on a physiological level. Psychological level, it also oftentimes serves a purpose. It helps one deal with their emotions. Oftentimes, if someone is anxious or depressed or is uncomfortable engaging other people, one of my clients refers to alcohol as liquid courage. If I'm nervous, well, if I drink, then all of a sudden I'm the life of the party. I don't have to worry about anything. And I would imagine even during the pandemic, many people being stressed, being cooped up at home, whatever it is, alcohol provides that avenue to at least feel better. And that in and of itself is concerning, because while alcohol helps you feel better, maybe while you're drinking, the second the effects of will wear off, you're right back where you started. So you're not actually gaining any healthy coping skills in terms of how to manage your mental health issues or manage the stresses in your life. You're simply putting a band-aid on it. The band-aid gets peeled off. That becomes those issues oftentimes are actually more prominent than they were when they first started. So those are things that we resonated. The other piece that I would say is, as I walk into a Shalom Zachar, is I reflect back to when I first started working in the addiction field in a substance abuse rehab. And there was a Friday night that I went to a Shalom Zachar, and I remember thinking to myself, 5 hours ago, I was talking to an individual about the ravaging effects that alcohol had on his life in terms of his marriage, in terms of his finances, his legal issues, in terms of his health, and we were talking about ways of avoiding alcohol use and how to manage, relapse triggers. And then I walk into Shalom Zachar, and the very substances that when I was talking to the individual in rehab were so taboo and so scary and dangerous, which it is, there's a whole smorgasbord of exactly those substances, out on the table for everyone to partake in, and people partaking at a level that, again, based on health guidelines, is not a healthy level of engagement. And for me, what it really struck a chord for was that here's something that is potentially very dangerous, and yet no one seems to be aware of it. No one's cognizant of it. And that oftentimes is a concern for me. And I've always thought about it more in terms of what is one's relationship with alcohol than whether or not they meet criteria for alcohol use disorder. Does your relationship with alcohol take primacy? Significant relationships in your life? Thinking back to the, pandemic, I think at the end of March or April, alcohol sales in the United States were up 54%. So here's a period of time where there's a lot of stress in terms of people being laid off, people needing, loans, a lot of financial issues, and yet people are spending 54% more. People are spending money, if you will, on alcohol, which last I checked is not free, right? And how do you work those together? And what that represents is that for those people at that time, their relationship with alcohol was more important, if you will, than their financial stability. Now, I would venture to guess no one's thinking about it that way, and there's no question that people probably aren't. But as we reflect backwards, I think sometimes that becomes an important thing to notice. And it's the same with regard to family relationships. Right? Am I leaving my Friday night dinner, right? Leaving my wife and my kids, high and dry, so to speak. I got to cut it short because I got to get to the Shalom Zachar on time, right? Now, if you're going because you want to celebrate with the father and the Shalom Zachar means a lot to you, okay. If you're going because I got to get there before they finish the 30-year bottle of whatever, then what you're really highlighting is that my relationship with alcohol is more important than my relationship with my kids or my wife. And that's something that I oftentimes encourage people to reflect upon. It's not about, do I have a problem or not? It's about quality, right? Is the quality of my relationships otherwise in my life, whether it be financial, whether it be health-wise, whether it be, legal, etc. Are those relationships more important to me than my relationship with alcohol? Or do I sometimes engage in my relationship with alcohol to the detriment of some of those other significant relationships? And that becomes something that I think is important. And just to finally add, the biggest concern that I've always felt, at a Shalom Zachar or any Jewish or any religious experience where alcohol is served is, what are we showing our kids? There are little kids that are running around the tables getting, candies and taking cakes and things like that. And what are they seeing by way of our interactions with, alcohol? Are they noticing that alcohol is dangerous? Or is the message that they're taking, hey, you know what, this is something that no problem, whenever I get either old enough or whenever someone offers me, then I'll take it, just like I'll take the gummy bears that are on the, tray over there. And that oftentimes is something that I'm curious about and frankly very worried about, is what are we showing our kids by our, to some extent, flippant interaction with alcohol. So those are just some, ideas off the top of my head in terms of when I enter situations like that.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and it's great to be back. It's only been 15 minutes. Yeah, you guys got me thinking. Also, thank you, Safi. And when I was growing up, my bar mitzvah, very interestingly, my bar mitzvah parsha is Noach. So anybody who knows Parshas Noach, everybody, those who laugh, and, Noach was the first, what did he do when he came out of the Teva? He went and he built the vineyard and all the ramifications, and he got drunk and all the stuff that went with it. So maybe it was an indication of what my life ended up being, and it was really. We talked about this before, and, just to mention that, I was 11 years old. I was in shul and Shabbos morning, and one of the old men called me over and says, Kimeran, nimm the shtick herring with a glaze of schnapps. Take a piece of herring with a glass of schnapps. And, the herring was bad enough, let me tell you, at 11 years old. But 4 things happened to me that day. And the first one was I hated the way it smelled. I hated the way it tasted. And I loved in 1 millionth of a second how it made me feel. And then there was that 4th thing that stayed with me for I don't know how many years. I wanted more. And that's indicative of what, where addiction is or what's going on inside of my system. And in my life, I've identified that there's 7 areas of my life that I cannot separate: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, financial, social, and sexual. And all these things are involved with this stuff. Dr. Rossman mentioned before, like I would pick up a drink and, I got taller, I got better looking, I was able to talk to women, I could dance, I could do all kind of stuff that I couldn't do. Forget halacha here, guys. I'm talking about halacha. But, the stuff that everybody was doing and I needed to do. And I think what we need to begin to do is differentiate between what's addictive drinking, what's substance use disorder, which only really affects, I shouldn't say only really, not only, it's not the right word I want to use, that affects probably 10 to 15% of the population, versus people who are heavy duty drinkers. There were guys who I used to drink with, that when they had sufficient reason, when the doctor said to them, okay, your liver's, swollen, or the boss said to them, you're going to lose your job. They had sufficient reason to stop, and they stopped. I wasn't that guy. I wasn't that guy. I was the guy that, even with all the emotional pleading of friends and neighbors and family, that, what about your family, and what about your kids, and what about everything? In that moment, I would say, yeah, I gotcha. And I would swear that I wouldn't pick it up. And if you put me on a lie detector test in that moment, I would never pick it up until 10 minutes later, when the next guy came by and offered me something, and I was off to the races again. So it's not so much about what was really not going on with me, is what was going on with me. And I happen to have been that guy that if I picked up a drink when the dose wore off, it was worse. And I've seen really a linear graph on this, that if our point is 0 and then we take a drink and it takes us up to 1, when it drops us down, it takes us below the 0 point. And I always have to catch up. I'm always running to catch up, and I'll never make it. So what's really going on here, and what are we doing, with the individual who has a problem, versus the culture that might have a problem, versus, like, who's got the best bottle? Incidentally, I was at one of my sons-in-law's houses, and I don't even see alcohol anymore, by the way. He's got a bottle. He's got this gorgeous bottle. I mean, etched bottle and everything. And I walked over and picked it up, and my daughter said to me, she says, Abba, what are you doing? I said, what are you talking about? She says, that's vodka. I didn't even realize. I mean, they've glamorized this so much, that it's so, ensnaring, that we don't even realize half the time what's going on. I think what we need to begin to do, and it's very hard, because if somebody does have an alcohol problem, their defiance and their rebellion will defend the fact that they don't have a problem. And it's the only disease that I know of that tells us we don't have a disease. For those who, that's my perspective of alcoholism. And our need to really identify the fact is, what are we doing as a culture, and what are we doing as a religion? What are we really, what's the real reasoning behind going to Shalom Zachar or Simchas Torah and stuff, that we're losing out, that we're finding in the bottom of a bottle instead of what the spiritual experience is supposed to be. And I think the more that we begin to examine that and examine it from a healthier, I'm going to use the term spiritual, viewpoint, the easier it's going to be for us to decide which way we're going to go and how we're going to deal with it. And not only it's how we're going to deal with it as adults, but as Sakshi mentioned before, what are we really showing our kids? Because if the kids find the solution in the bottom of a bottle, instead of going to shul and davening, or instead of being involved with other people and being able to give our lives away in a healthy fashion, we're already behind the 8 ball. So I open it up to everybody. Their questions are welcome, and thank you for having us here. You're muted, Judy.
Thank you. I just realized. One of the questions that actually popped up in the earlier session that we didn't have time to address was, we had been discussing modeling our behavior, and in particular, the Pesach Seder as a very difficult sort of model of what do we do. And we've also been discussing teenagers, their rebellion. The question that came up was, what is the best way to address it at the Seder? You have a late teen, family member at your Seder. How do you model and discuss what's truly appropriate when they're still under drinking age?
I'll start that. It's a very good question. Before we get to the Pesach Seder, I just want to make a general comment. As I'm listening to this conversation the second time around, I got a little bored, and I'm just Googling a little bit, which is never a good idea. It just occurred to me something very interesting, and that is that as a community, we have completely shunned peanuts. We have eliminated peanuts from our schools, some of us from our shuls, and we have sensitized the entire community that there is a significant number of people among us who have peanut allergies. I didn't know how many are there actually, because I didn't know. So granted, you can't always trust what you come up with first on your first response on Google. But according to Google, there are 1 in 200 adults in the United States that have a peanut allergy, and 1 in 50 children, which is not an insignificant number. When comparing that with the number of people who meet the diagnostic criteria for alcohol use disorder, it's 1 in 8 American adults, 12.7%. So I think, as a community, we should do a little bit of a cheshbon nefesh over here. I'm certainly not saying that we should rebel and force the schools to allow us to send our kids to school with peanuts. Certainly not. But if we are all sensitive and aware of the fact that there are vulnerable people among us, and even having, peanuts in the room is something that could be potentially harmful, maybe even worst case scenario, life-threatening. Statistically speaking, you can't even compare. We have so many people among us who have an allergy, and that's really, really what it is. Arnie's such a genuine, humble guy. So he talks about his journey in a way that you almost get the impression, that this is just, something's in his head. But the reality is, as Dr. Rossman alluded to earlier, there are physiological realities over here. Addiction in general, alcohol addiction is it's a disease, and it's an allergy that one develops over the course of time, and we need to be sensitive to that. Now, in terms of the question of the Pesach Seder, I would just say like this. First of all, you absolutely have to know who is at your table. I don't want to go into details, not about me, but in our extended family, what we do at our Pesach Seder, at our Purim Suda, has changed dramatically over the course of time, and it swings back and forth depending on who's there. And I'm talking about my own children and my nephews and my nieces. I mean, it's not always the same. It's not always the same, and that's okay. That's perfectly appropriate. So you need to know who's there at any given point. In my opinion, nobody should ever be getting drunk at the Pesach Seder. So in terms of the type of wine that is consumed and who is doing the consuming and who is controlling that consuming and who's overseeing that, it has to be, and it's not because the danger of somebody getting drunk. It's the message that is being imparted to the participants, particularly the kids, and that is that's what Pesach is about. And Pesach Seder is not about getting drunk. It is true that Chazal preferred alcohol because it's derech because yeah, it does take the edge off. And for a person who is, not predisposed, that is not at risk, there's really no harm in that. But to get drunk, absolutely not. Somebody has to take responsibility for that, from the outset. In my opinion, if there's anybody at risk at the Seder, there should be no alcohol whatsoever at the Seder. Again, we can get into the finer points not right now as to how you define at risk, but if there's somebody over there who is still in the throes of their struggle and has not gotten it under control, it is, at the very least, it is insensitive, grossly insensitive, but it may be actually reckless and irresponsible. I personally feel you should be wearing masks if you're in public around other people right now. That's my opinion. If you agree that if you go into the store, you should be wearing a mask, you cannot reconcile that with saying, I think you should be wearing a mask right now during the global pandemic that we're all living through. But if somebody else at my Pesach Seder has a problem with alcohol, it's his problem. It's not mine. Those two positions cannot be reconciled.
And I would add, I think when you think about addressing the issue, even talking about the decisions that we make becomes important. I think, unfortunately, there's oftentimes a big stigma surrounding addiction or surrounding alcoholism. And, in terms of modeling behavior, it's one thing for a parent or whoever's running the Seder to say, okay, well, we're only going to serve grape juice and just do it without ever talking about it. It's another thing to say, well, we're serving grape juice because, and not because X and Y are joining us, right? But because the emphasis that we're having Rashi Light, because it has barely any alcohol in it, because the emphasis of the Seder is V'yigader Levincha, is to share the story of our freedom and to talk to our children about Pesach. And we're much clearer and we're much better able to do that when we have a clear head. And talking about alcohol in that way is not just modeling the behavior, but it's also taking away the potential stigma, which also then provides the child or the teenager the information that if at some point they start struggling with alcohol use or any other kind of addiction or any other kind of problematic behavior, this is something you can talk about. There's not, well, we talk about it and the things that we don't talk about. We talk about everything, and we're willing to talk about alcohol. We're willing to talk about, any other kind of behavior that might be problematic for you or any other struggle that you might have. And I think sometimes talking through our thought processes is one of the best way to model the behavior, not just doing the behavior.
We're getting into a topic that we, again, fortunately, we don't have a lot of time to answer, but I think if it gets to a point that Pesach or any holiday comes that we're first worried about how to deal with it, it's already too late. It's a problem. It's really a problem. And it goes back to what are we modeling? What are we showing our kids? How do we identify the difference between potential problems or on the way to being, having problems? What's really, addiction? What's not addiction? A 12% number on our population is a pretty high number. I grew up, when I grew up in the 70s and 80s, I grew up way before the 70s and 80s, but in the 70s and 80s, there were studies, crazy studies, that there's no such thing as a Jewish alcoholic. I could show you the white papers on it. I still have them on my bookshelf back there. And I went to a therapist in Muncie with beer down to the middle of his chest, sitting in his big leather chair. I thought he was Moshe Rabbeinu's first cousin. And he said to me, Arnie, there's no such thing as a Jewish alcoholic, but I want you to go to your doctor and go get some anti-anxiety medication and sleep medication. And this is from a guy, this is like, where are we? We get lost between the cracks of us being lost. So if we get to the point that Pesach comes or Purim comes or Simchas Torah or Shalom Zocher comes, and we're first asking a question, I think we're way behind the 8 ball. And I think the way to do this is really, and people aren't going to hear it, because if I already have a problem with a substance use disorder, it really doesn't make a difference, and I'm going to go find a way to do it anyway. If the parents are modeling it or encouraging it without realizing who their kids are, they're behind the 8 ball. Because if I just put down, again, we talked about this before, if I just put down the drugs and alcohol and my life got better, then I wouldn't have a problem. I'm a guy that I put down drugs and alcohol, my life gets infinitely worse because there's too many other areas in my life that I have. Not only do I don't have skills for, but I can't cope with it. I can't cope with any of this stuff. And alcohol and drugs were my solution. Now, how do we go about doing this? And this is a whole, this would probably, Judy, this would be a symposium in and of itself for probably about 3 weeks on how to do this. But I think the easiest way to start this, as Safi talked about, is let's start a conversation, guys. Let's start, and by the way, in our own family, it could be, listen, I got one grandkid in the same family, and I'm saving a seat for him anytime he's ready for it. And I have another grandkid who wouldn't touch the stuff with a 10-foot pole, 20-foot pole, but a 100-foot pole. So how do we begin to do this? And it really comes from a sincere honesty, from a persistence, from an understanding of what substance use disorder is really about. The same way if somebody got sick, God forbid, and he's in the hospital with cancer, and how it affects everybody in the hospital. Listen, when my sister was sick and dying, everybody was affected. There was like 35 people that were affected, and everybody had to take, part of this. The same way over here, we got to take a look at this, because ultimately we're talking about people's, life and death. Our kids are dying. Okay, we're dying. Forget about our kids. I mean, I'm not forget about our kids. I don't mean like that. We're all dying, and we really got to take a look at it. And we have to differentiate between the use and the misuse of the substance. Alcohol's been around for a very long time.
Actually, thank you. That was a great lead into sort of one of the other question that came up, which is how can we reframe our religion's seeming focus on wine as an integral part of the ritual so that it's secondary to the actual spiritual function of the ritual?
So,
Rabbi, I'm going to give that one.
So I just wanted to say one thing, and then I think Rabbi Rothwachs could address the halachic, I guess, part is, growing up, I never felt that the wine was the focus of the ritual, and that was because within my family, that was never the focus, and I think the very question gives you a lot of information, right? The fact that one would wonder, how do you emphasize the ritual part versus the alcohol? What it says is, like Arnie was saying, you're working backwards.
You're muted. You're muted.
We've already started, in a place where, in a sense, we ideally wouldn't be. So that's what I would kind of offer, is that when starting families, making the point to highlight the importance of the ritual, of the Jewish part versus the alcohol, that starts the ball rolling, in a positive direction. And I guess in this sense, I'll sort of put out a plea, especially to the women in the audience, the mothers out there. They play a very strong role in shaping the way that the household is held, what the meals look like. And I think in a lot of families, the fathers tend to take over in terms of the alcohol, providing that in the context of a meal, etc. And especially with regard to a lot of the Jewish rituals, many of them might be surrounding attendance at shul or whatever it is, where there might be more male involvement in the alcohol use than the women. But I would kind of put the plea out to everyone that when setting up the family, making sure that the primacy is the Jewish and the ritual, and the alcohol is not even a close second. It's sort of okay, we need wine, let's say for Kiddush, so how much wine do we need? And okay, we'll do it, as opposed to making that something that's more of a focus. But I would yield to Rabbi Rothwachs.
Yeah, all excellent points. Listen, I would just say, only in the interest of time, because we're almost out of time. We really can't go through the entire spectrum of Jewish ritual life and experience. I will just say, as a general comment, there in every area of halacha and Jewish living experience, there's always a tendency to focus on the wrong things and to exaggerate how important one thing is at the expense of another. we see that again and again. Again, this is not a new problem. The prophets speak about this all the time. The fact that we sort of, we got it all wrong. We're focusing on the wrong things. We're focusing on the externals, etc. So this is just one feature of a problem that we have in general. And that is that we go through the motions and we do things because that's the way we've always seen them done. And sometimes we just don't know that something's a question. We're embarrassed to ask a question. We don't know the difference between, you know, as I mentioned beforehand, a law and, you know, a halacha, an obligation and a custom. As I already alluded to, but I'm just going to say right now, there is no situation where a person who either themselves or is concerned about others as being somewhat at risk is required to consume any alcohol whatsoever. I can say that with full confidence. It is true that in a situation where there is no risk, there sometimes is a preference to use alcohol. I will tell you that my Rebbe, Rabbi Willig, you know, uses grape juice for Havdalah. Why? Not because he has any problem with consuming alcohol, because in his opinion, we're not going to get into the sugya, so to speak, right now. For Havdalah, there really is no preference to use wine over a grape juice, and so therefore his default position is, if I don't, so to speak, have to have wine, I'm not going to have wine. It's very interesting. You know, it's an attitude that one takes, and maybe that's partially, I mean, I'm sure it's to a large extent due to the fact that he has been a lightning rod for so many, God forbid, some of the terrible, life-threatening situations and questions and challenges that people have to deal with. He knows what's out there. So again, it's not just that he's personally been sort of beaten into submission and is afraid to touch alcohol, but, you know, as a leader, to say, you know what, we rarely, if ever, actually have to include alcohol in our rituals, and when we do, it could be done, you know, in a very, very scaled back way. There is never an obligation to get drunk, ever, under any circumstances whatsoever, and you know, that's something that, you know, we need to be mindful of. I don't know who I'm speaking to right now. I mean, I recognize some of the faces, and I don't recognize any of the names, which is fine. But if anything I'm saying to you strikes you as being odd or maybe, you know, I don't know, heretical, feel free to, you know, reach out to me. I'm happy to discuss it with you further and cite chapter and verse. But I think we need to be confident, very, very confident as Jews, as observant Jews, and as knowledgeable Jews, that the halacha never make any demands of us which jeopardize our health. And if there's ever a perception of a conflict, it's because we don't understand the halacha, and we need to become more informed so we can, you know, navigate our way through these challenging situations, as both Arnie and Sachi mentioned, in a way that highlights the spiritual parts of these rituals, ultimately that which is most important, but certainly never to put anybody at any risk.
I think with that, I'm afraid we need to wrap up. We're pretty much out of time. I want to thank Rabbi Rothwachs, Arnie, Dr. Rossman, for your time and your insight this morning. It was really terrific. Thank you to all who joined. Just a quick reminder that the recordings will be available on the CCSA website. I popped up the URL in the chat for you, just in case you don't recall. And thank you very much. And we hope maybe next time we get together, we'll have more success stories as we all get more educated and strive to do better to help everyone, ourselves and everyone around us. Thank you very much, everybody.